Earth crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck blackberries. Earth crammed with heaven. Consider a box crammed with ribbon, satin pastel reaching out from under the top. Consider the Boston waterways 400 years ago, crammed with enough salmon it was said women could walk across their backs to get over the river. Consider a summer crumble, crammed with so many blueberries they've escaped the baking dish and have fallen to the oven floor. Consider a bush so crammed with the power of the divine, it sets itself afire. Many years ago, during one of the service auctions in my home congregation, I purchased 3 peonies. And I planted them in front of my house. It's interesting to me that I'm even thinking of these peonies. The woman who had cultivated them died just a few weeks ago, and yet her peonies have been blooming in front of my house for decades and will, I think, for decades, just bringing her life back to my home. But they have been there, and every April, there's kind of nothing there in the front of the house. They generally, I've either cut them back or they were completely neglected in the winter, and they're sort of lying scraggly, unconscious. In May, life springs from the warm, wet ground, and by June, those peonies have grown 5 feet across, and the very tight pink and white bulbs that have been fighting to develop unfold in a grand display of splendor and triumph. Peonies send out their sweet aroma as a call to the garden, and ants make their pilgrimage there, climbing the stems to submerge themselves in the soft cradle of the flowers, surrounded by summer's fragrance. Earth crammed with heaven. So I have no intention this morning of invoking our powers of reason or logic to prove poetry. I'll spend no time detailing the evidence of my case. I will sometimes, I'm just not doing it today. It's July. My theology, like yours, begins with my experience, which I often understand in metaphor. We live in a world offering truth and beauty around every corner. The task of being alive is to experience it. The task is to know every common bush afire with God. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote that poem using the imagery of the book of Exodus. So many of you know the passage, but for those who don't, here's what it says. Moses was tending his flock when the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said to him, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals. You are standing on holy ground. We are standing on holy ground. The challenge is to know the bush is on fire, to see and feel and hear our name being called, being beckoned by love. Annie Dillard has a great story about a bird she happened upon in a tree while he was having himself some fun. She writes, the mockingbird took a single step from the air and dropped. His wings were still folded against his sides as though he were singing from a limb and not falling, accelerating 32 feet per second through empty air. Just a breath before he would have been dashed to the ground, he unfurled his wings with exact deliberate care, revealing the broad bars of white, spread his elegant white banded tail, and so floated onto the grass. I had just rounded a corner when his step caught my eye. There was no one else in sight. The fact of his free fall was like the old philosophical conundrum about the tree that falls in the forest. The answer must be, I think, that beauty and grace are performed whether or not we will or sense them. The least we can do is try to be there. The mockingbird jumping, earth crammed with heaven. When we are there, when we are awake, we see the universe spark and flame. Every common bush afire with God. That burning bush moment in Scripture isn't the primary source of the covenant between God and humans, but it's one example of a moment humans are called to see. The reason God was calling Moses was to tell him it's time to lead his people out of bondage. God said he heard the cry of the oppressed, and he needed partners to work for their liberation. But it's also a gorgeous moment of knowing that the Spirit of love has set the universe on fire, that we are heard, we are seen, we are called by name. The mockingbird would fall in joy and fun, whether or not we see it. It's so easy to slip into the illusion of separation, of distance from all around us. We see ourselves as independent from the spirit of love, from people, even from earth, the living context of being alive. We forget the gift, the wonder, the flames all around us. We sit around and pluck blackberries. It's really an amazing feat, actually, since all we are and see and have and know is the result of abundance on this planet. And yet we live in ignorance of our profound attachment and of the holiness of the physical world. We are one, each sourced from this earth. Yet we live not only convinced of our own independence from each other, but from nature herself. Our way of life rests on the illusion that we can bypass the rhythms of life, that we can build an environment that will keep us entirely separate. Our built environment allows for the illusion that we're not part of the ecosystem, not responsible or accountable in any way. We can just sit around the blackberry bush, never noticing that it's on fire with the divine spirit. We live as if we've been set free from forces of nature or from the base existence of our ancestors. What we fail to recognize is that rather than being liberated, we have been torn from our roots, from the very ground of our being. We have become blind to the most basic facts of life. We've lost our connection to the planet and to the holy it embodies and demonstrates for us. Nature is not one aspect of life, but the platform for living. It's the air I'm breathing as I speak. The air we are all breathing and sharing. It's these wooden pews we are sitting in. It's the field of cotton from which my shirt was grown, as well as the dye that gives it color. It's the metals mined and smelt that create this music stand, and the fossil or maybe renewable energy that keeps this building lit, keeps our food cold, our coffee hot. It's from earth that the materials were extracted to build this building and the skyscrapers and malls and highways. It's what Sally McFague calls second nature. It's the nature we exploit for our comfort, from which we detach long enough that we forget the source. Not only can we not be separated from nature, we can't be separated from the love that is embodied in it all. And it's not just the beautiful, not just the blackberry bushes and the peonies, but the buffalo stampeding, the wolves hunting, hurricanes, blizzards, tornadoes that tear through sleepy towns and entire island nations. Earth might be crammed with heaven, but it's also wild, feral, unsafe, untamed, uncivilized. Our ancestors fell victim over and over again to the turbulent forces of nature. We've lost something in that removal of ourselves from nature's forces, even as we've gained health, comfort, safety. Henry David Thoreau, jealous of the raw, immediate life of the past, removed himself from second nature and lived for a time in a more primal way. He sought to connect with the ferocity and the freedom. In his essay, Walking, he says, "Give me a wildness whose glance no civilization can endure, as if we lived on the marrow of koodoos devoured raw." There is a God in the wildness, a God who is raw and primal and honest. Every tree and spider and sea lion is an expression of that God, is the divine embodiment of all that is wonderful and terrible. And this God is not tame. The God of Christian culture, embodied by a too often white Jesus, is too civilized for me. I appreciate the model of patience and love and kindness and generosity, but it fits into the box a little too well. Remember, earth crammed with heaven. If Jesus is the way we know incarnation, the way we know earth to be the embodiment of God, we have to be introduced to his wild side. We should talk about how he smelled, how dry his skin was, about his thick, tangled hair from all those years living in the desert. We should tell often of the story of Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple in a fit of rage. We should know that to be incarnate is to be untamed, to be filled and stuffed with the magic and mystery of existence. I saw a fawn this week. She was nursing the tiny deer, standing beneath her mother, happy as any child could possibly be. She was wagging her tail so hard her whole hind legs were jumping off of the ground. I've seen her playing with two other fawns, running through the woods, jumping over rock piles and down trees. There are 3 of them, filled with the joy and freedom of summertime. Earth crammed with heaven. The natural way is sometimes violent, but it's also gorgeous and lavish. Grace is bursting forth. I mean, I live in the woods. I've said this before. Our home is near a branch of the Croton River, which floats and wanders and sometimes storms through the trees teeming with trout. People from all over go there to fish. They walk from the train in big waterproof, they sort of rubber pants held on by suspenders tucked into these high water boots carrying fishing boxes and poles. And they wade into the water at almost any temperature and they walk down the river until they get to a place they can feel entirely alone. And they cast their lines into the water and they wait for something to bite. It's a catch and release river, so whatever they get, they remove and they throw back into the water. Mostly though, they just stand there. They stand in the river without moving. They stand and they look like they are letting water and silence and trees heal them. Annie Dillard writes, "My God, I look at the creek, it never stops. You don't run down the present Pursue it with baited hooks and nets. You wait for it, empty-handed, and you are filled. You have fish left over. The creek is the one great giver. It is by definition Christmas, incarnation. Earth is crammed with heaven. This we all see. It's all that we are. It's all that we do. Everything we have. This is the body of God. Our task is to see every common bush of fire. It is all and always holy. The creek, the mockingbird, the kudu, the blackberry bush. Earth is alive with the spirit of love, with a power and life that is greater than the sum of the parts. And every common bush and stream and cloud has been ignited. It is time now for all of us to take off our shoes.